Feet of Clay, A Study of Gurus by Anthony Storr. Chapter 1. Paranoid Enclosures. Jim Jones and David Koresh. The infamous dictators of the 20th century, Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, Ceausescu, and Mao Zedong, were all unscrupulous in the pursuit of power and ruthless in eliminating enemies. Dictators cannot afford the luxury of friends. Although they may marry and rear families, they depend primarily upon the plaudits of the unknown multitude, rather than on true affection from intimates, to maintain their self-esteem. It is not surprising that leaders of this type become suspicious, often to the point of paranoia. The crowd is fickle and easily swayed. Dictators who depend upon popular acclaim and propaganda alone can be unseated by the adverse events which plague all political leaders. If a dictator is to hold on to power, even when a country is in trouble, he must ensure that he is totally in control and that no rival has a chance of supplanting him. To do so requires the apparatus of informers, secret police, and spies, which is so characteristic of dictatorial regimes. The number of people who have been banished, imprisoned, tortured, or executed for no reason other than that a dictator perceived them as possible threats to his position is beyond computation. Moreover, it is those who are high in the dictator's hierarchy who are most likely to be seen as threatening. Paradoxically, the friends and allies on whom a normal leader might depend for advice and support during crises often constitute the greatest threat to the paranoid dictator. Hitler's purge of Ernst Röhm and his stormtrooper lieutenants in 1934 is a typical example. Hitler owed a great deal to Röhm, who had supported him from his earliest days in Munich. But this did not save him when he became a threat. Both Stalin and Mao Zedong disposed of their closest associates without hesitation. As we shall see, some gurus are dictators on a small scale. Although their message is ostensibly religious rather than political, they behave like dictators, thrive on adulation, have no true friends, attempt to exercise absolute power, and are afflicted by the same kind of paranoid suspicions. Let us look at two gurus who fit this description. On November the 18th, 1978, over 900 people, including 260 children, drank or were injected with cyanide in Jonestown, Guyana. This self-annihilation of members of the People's Temple was ordered by its founder, Jim Jones, who himself died of a gunshot wound to the head. On April 19th, 1993, 86 people, including 22 children, perished in the flames of Ranch Apocalypse, Waco, Texas. This self-immolation was at the instigation of the cult leader David Koresh, who also died of a gunshot wound to the head. There are other remarkable resemblances between the two gurus. In childhood, both were rather isolated boys who had few friends amongst contemporaries. Both became eloquent, fluent preachers who could harangue their listeners for hours at a time, battering their audiences into submission by the apparently endless flow of words. Both were entirely unscrupulous sexually. Jim Jones with both sexes, David Koresh with young children as well as with adults. Both were physically cruel, inflicting vicious punishments upon any member of their respective cults who was deemed guilty of infringing the arbitrary rules which they had instituted. Both did all they could to prevent their disciples leaving the cult, by undermining family ties, by threatening dire punishments, and by posting armed guards who were as much concerned with keeping people in as with protecting the enclosures from intruders, although very few disciples wanted to leave. Both exhibited obsessional traits of character and paranoid anxieties which led to their stockpiling weapons against the attacks which they were expecting. Both hovered on the brink of insanity for a considerable part of their lives, and both ended up as demonstrably psychotic. I have no doubt that, in the course of history, there have been other gurus as repellent as these two. But it is difficult to imagine any who were more so. The fact that so many people worshipped them to the point of being prepared to commit suicide at their behest is terrifying. Their aim was absolute power, and the ultimate expression of power over others is to bring about their death. Perhaps a closer look at these two monsters can teach us something about gurus and the fanaticism which they inspire. Jim Jones was born in Lynn, Indiana, on May the 13th, 1931. His early childhood was somewhat isolated, since his father was a partial invalid and his mother had to go out to work. He described himself as always being alone, and he became a fanatical reader. A neighbour, Mrs. Kennedy, acted as a mother substitute and inculcated the boy with religious ideas from an early age. At high school, he did well, and was rated as having an IQ of 115 to 18. He developed an extraordinary verbal fluency. When he was still quite young, he abandoned Methodism and joined the Pentecostal church. This may have been because of some crisis of faith, of the kind characteristic of gurus, but it seems equally likely that Jones believed that the Pentecostal church would offer him more opportunity to display his talents as a preacher and spiritual healer. He was allowed to address the congregation of the Pentecostal church when he was still quite young. As he was handsome as well as persuasive, he soon discovered that he could hold an audience. He was reported as appearing entirely certain of himself, with an air of authority and complete conviction. Even as a schoolboy of 10, Jones claimed special powers. In Indianapolis, he became known as a charismatic preacher who championed the rights of the underprivileged. In 1953, he said, "I've come to the realization of the Holy Spirit." But his beliefs were anything but orthodox. Although Jones claimed divine inspiration and was a persuasive preacher, his actual message was more political than religious, being principally concerned with racial integration and what he called socialism. He did promise a new way of life to his followers, but this was based on a primitive Marxist vision rather than upon religious revelation. In fact, he attacked the Bible as an aggressive text, supporting capitalism, slavery, and racial discrimination. He also poured scorn upon the sky god of conventional Christianity, claiming that his followers had no need of such a god, when he came as, quoting, "your socialist worker god," end quote. Quoting again, "the only thing that brings perfect freedom, justice, and equality, perfect love in all its beauty and holiness, is socialism," end quote. He prided himself on having delivered the goods to his followers, which the sky god had failed to deliver. No doubt his powers of oratory went some way to compensate him for his isolation. But Jones remained pathologically anxious about being deserted by such friends as he had, and later by his disciples. As a youth, he invited an acquaintance for dinner. When the lad said that he must leave before Jones wished him to do so, Jones fired a gun at him, narrowly missing him. Jones, who was always a neat dresser, was obsessionally preoccupied with cleanliness and avoided anything which might make him sweat. Like many people of obsessional personality, He had a strong wish to bring everything under his own control, including those around him. His wife, Marceline, whom he married in June 1949, soon regretted her choice because she found him so dominant and overbearing. In 1956, he set up his People's Temple in Indianapolis. The emphasis was on racial equality. Jones and his wife were the first white couple in Indianapolis to adopt a black child. At the time, mixed congregations were a rarity, and many of his black congregation felt that their status had been enhanced by Jones's refusal to discriminate. Much of his early preaching was concerned with calling up individuals from the congregation and touching them in the name of the Lord, at which point some entered into a trance-like state. In the early days of the People's Temple, Jones undoubtedly did some good. He established soup kitchens for the poor and also provided coal and clothes for them. When he moved the temple to Redwood Valley in California in 1965, Jones operated a ranch for mentally handicapped boys, nursing homes for the elderly, homes for foster children, and a daycare center. These enterprises apparently provided excellent services. Jones was skillful at cultivating important people and succeeded in impressing Jane Fonda, Angela Davis, Daniel Ellsberg, and Rosalind Carter, with whom he once shared a platform. Jones claimed divinely inspired clairvoyance, which he invoked as explaining his knowledge of the personal histories and secrets of those whom he called up. In reality, he employed spies who discovered these secrets by passing on information gleaned from personal inquiries, unauthorized entries into homes, and even from combing through dustbins. Jones specialized in services of healing, for which he claimed he had a divine gift. Many of his so-called cures were faked. People brought in wheelchairs would be told that they were healed and could walk. In fact, these were disguised members of the People's Temple who had been trained for the role. Jones had no hesitation in claiming to cure cancer. An individual would be told that he had cancer of the bowel and instructed to go to the lavatory. Then a bloody mass of animal intestine would be produced as evidence that the cancer had been miraculously evacuated. Complicity in his deceptions as a healer was one way in which Jones gained control over members of his cult. Sexual confessions were another. Some were compelled to sign confessions to crimes which they had not committed. Members of the temple had to abrogate anything which ministered to their sense of individuality. Possessions, children, spouses, and the ownership of their own bodies. Everything was to be held in common. Jones, like many other gurus, was good at raising money. By 1975, the temple's assets were rated at $10 million. Jones was more obviously a confidence trickster than many gurus, but this did not prevent Eugene Chaikin, a Californian attorney who became a member of the temple, from describing him as the most loving, Christ-like human being he had ever met. Another law graduate, Tim Stone, called Jones the most compassionate, honest, and courageous human being the world contains. In 1972, Stone signed a paper requesting that Jones sire a child by his wife, since he himself was unable to do so. As lawyers are not generally noted for being particularly gullible, these opinions are impressive testimony to Jones's powers of persuasion. Jones acceded to Stone's request, and a later legal conflict about the custody of the ensuing child was one factor leading to the exposure and downfall of Jonestown. Because Jim Jones would not give up John Victor Stone, as a San Francisco judge had ordered, the little boy perished in Jonestown, along with the others. In 1972, Jones again moved to the temple, this time to San Francisco. But disquieting rumors about his claims to heal the sick and raise the dead, combined with accusations of misappropriating funds soon made him think it advisable to leave California. By 1974, an advance team was clearing an area of jungle in Guyana which Jones had bought from the government for what he called an agricultural project. In May 1977, a massive exodus of temple members from San Francisco and Los Angeles resulted in the establishment of Jonestown, a settlement so remote from the coastal capital, Georgetown, that it took 36 hours to reach it by steamer and riverboat. Guyana was chosen because it had a history of offering sanctuary to a variety of fugitives, including a number of criminals, and the black leader Malcolm X. A convert to Islam and black power, Malcolm X was expelled from Britain for dope dealing, fled to Trinidad, and after committing murder fled to Guyana. Jones himself became permanent resident there from July 1977. About 70% of those who followed Jones to Guyana were black. About 2/3 were female. As Aileen Barker has pointed out, the membership of the People's Temple was unlike the typical membership of most contemporary cults. Jonestown was originally called an agriculturalist commune, and the People's Temple were not classified as a new religious movement until after the mass death of its members. The settlement which Jonestown established was publicized as utopian, a place from which disease had all but vanished because of Jones's efforts as a divinely gifted healer. A paradise of racial equality, economic equality, and communal bliss. In fact, as some reported it, it was more like a concentration camp presided over by a cruel and ruthless commandant. Jones's need to bring everything and everyone under his own control came near to fulfillment in this remote place. According to Deborah Blakey, a former financial secretary of the temple, who managed to get out in April 1978, the commune lived under a reign of terror. She told Shiva Naipaul that most people were required to work in the fields for 11 hours a day on grossly inadequate rations. As a result, extreme loss of weight, chronic diarrhea, and recurrent fever affected half the inhabitants. Medical treatment was practically non-existent. One middle-aged ex-merchant seaman was forced to work until his shoulder was raw from humping lumber as he broke down sobbing. He was beaten up and forced to crawl in front of Jones to beg forgiveness. The settlement was constantly patrolled by armed guards. Jones threatened that anyone who tried to escape would be killed, forbade telephone calls to the outside world, ensured that mail was censored, and confiscated passports and money. He also told them that the settlement was surrounded by mercenaries of the Guyanese army who would capture and torture any defectors and castrate any males who attempted to escape. Jones himself, together with some favourites, enjoyed a varied and more than adequate diet from foods stored in his personal refrigerator. He considered himself entitled to have sexual relations with anyone of either sex, although it was noted by his son Stephen that nearly all his father's partners were white. Some were undoubtedly given drugs to make them more amenable. Jones affirmed that he was the only truly heterosexual male in the settlement and alleged that many of the other males had not come to terms with their homosexual feelings. To demonstrate this, he found it advisable to bugger some of them. One victim is reported as saying, "Your fucking me in the arse was, as I see it now, necessary to get me to deal with my deep-seated repression against my homosexuality." This man seems to have had no realization of being exploited, no consciousness that Jones might be exercising power over him, and at the same time gaining personal sexual satisfaction from him. Farther, as they called him, could do no wrong, and sex with father was generally reported as an incomparable experience. Punishments were generally carried out in public on the stage of the church. Beatings were inflicted with a 3-foot paddle, and some beatings lasted half an hour. Grace Stone saw her son John Victor beaten in public, but when she finally escaped from the settlement in July 1976, she had to leave the child behind. Victims of beatings had their cries amplified by microphones held to their lips. A child who soiled his pants was forced to wear them on his head, forbidden food, and made to watch others eating. Children were sometimes tossed into a well near Jones's bungalow and pulled down into the water by aides who were already swimming there. Their screams of fear could be heard all over the settlement. Another punishment was a boxing match in which the offender was made to fight with a much stronger adversary who would beat him semi-conscious. Other offenders were forced to eat hot peppers or had a hot pepper stuffed up the rectum. Jones's son Stephen recalled that his 16-year-old friend, Vincent Lopez, was forced to chew a pepper. To save him from being compelled to chew another, Stephen caught his friend's vomit in his hand so that he could swallow it again. Another punishment was to be confined in a crate too small to permit standing for days at a time. Some offenders were given electric shocks from a machine known as Bigfoot. As Jones himself deteriorated both mentally and physically, Jonestown appears to have come close to resembling Belsen. Yet, as Shiva Naipaul indicates in his book Journey to Nowhere, there was another side to Jonestown. Some reported that their lives had been radically changed for the better, that Jonestown, because of its insistence on racial integration, had removed the stigma of being black and given them a new dignity. Others who had previously been alcoholic or drug addicts claimed to have been saved by the temple or by Jones himself. Dr. James S. Gordon, a psychiatrist who interviewed a number of survivors over a period of 10 years, was impressed with the fact that none regretted their stay in Jonestown. It is evident that some people who had been alienated from conventional society felt themselves part of a new community in which they were, for the first time, accepted and valued. Naipaul writes that some experienced Jonestown as a paradise, while others found it a nightmare. Jim Jones's confidence in himself was not based, as it is with most of us, on feeling loved and appreciated by friends and family, but on his ability to impress others with his fluent oratory. I have no doubt that this isolated youth entirely convinced himself, as he convinced others, that he was endowed with special powers and spiritual insight. Like the dwarf Alberich in Wagner's Das Rheingold, Jones abandoned the search for love in favour of the acquisition of power. The savage punishments described earlier are a demonstration of his misuse of power. It is hardly credible that mothers could have tolerated such physical abuse of their children, or that adults would submit to such public pain and humiliation. But, as we shall see, Jones was not unique in his punitive methods. His sexual behaviour indicates that he used sex as a way to dominate others, rather than as an expression of love. His corrupt sexual behaviour went hand in hand with his elitist conviction of his own superiority. Jones felt entitled to be better fed when his followers were half starving, and was better housed than they were. But, although the People's Temple accumulated considerable funds, he does not seem to have been attracted by conventional trappings of wealth in the shape of Rolls-Royces, yachts, or gold trinkets. What fascinated him was the exercise of power over other people. Jones perfectly illustrates the difficulty in defining the borderlines between conviction delusion, confidence trickery, and psychosis. Perhaps more overtly than any guru with whom I am concerned, except Gurdjieff, Jones was a confidence trickster. He had no scruples about faking cures of illness, or of pretending to collapse when it appeared desirable, or in inventing attacks from imagined enemies. He once broke a window and claimed that a brick on the floor had been thrown at him. Unfortunately for him, the absence of broken glass within the room demonstrated that the window had been broken from the inside. In Jonestown, he claimed that enemies had fired at him and produced bullets in evidence. In fact, his adopted son, Jimmy, had fired the shots, and was seen to do so by Vincent Lopez, whose punishment by forced eating of a hot pepper was referred to earlier. Jones was always inclined to suspect that he was being persecuted by agents of the United States government, including the Internal Revenue and the CIA. No doubt because he was in reality guilty of financial misdemeanors, and also because he outspokenly condemned the administrations fascist and racist. However, as he got older, his suspicions took on more and more the colouring of paranoid delusions until, in Jonestown, his tediously long broadcast harangues amounted to the ramblings of a psychotic. This mental deterioration was undoubtedly promoted by the large quantities of drugs, including amphetamines and antidepressants, which he took for a variety of ailments, both real and imagined. During the 1970s, Jones drove home his paranoid message with increasing force. He alleged that the San Francisco authorities were preparing concentration camps for ethnic minorities, and by the mid-1970s he had accumulated at least 200 guns. In Jonestown, he added this to his armoury by smuggling more weapons in crates containing machinery. These were generally obtained from the San Francisco Gun Exchange, or Bible Exchange, as it was known in Jonestown. Jones began to announce himself as God around 1974. Before this, he had generally claimed to be a messenger from God with a divine gift of healing. Later, he said, "I come as God socialist." End quote. Drugs made him more inclined to claim divine status, but how far he believed in his own divinity is an open question. According to the New Yorker of the 22nd of November 1993, his wife Marceline tried to persuade their son Stephen to talk his father into giving up drugs. Stephen replied, "You're talking about going to God and telling him he's a drug addict?" End quote. The inhabitants of Jonestown were well prepared in advance for their eventual death. Jones kept on telling them that he expected the settlement to be attacked by a variety of foes, and that if this happened, the only way out might be suicide. He announced that the community must come together or die rather than be split up. If death was to be the final solution, this would not be in vain, for it would vividly demonstrate to the world the evil nature of the US government. In spite of this, there is some doubt about how many people actually committed suicide and how many have been murdered. Reports by survivors and examination of the site of injection in the corpses suggests that more were murdered than was originally supposed. The sheer scale of the Jonestown disaster shocked the world. But tragic events of a similar kind have occurred since, and more can certainly be expected. Let us turn from Jonestown to Ranch Apocalypse. Vernon Howell, as Koresh was originally named, was born on the 17th of August 1959, to a 14-year-old girl. When her lover left her 2 years later, she placed the baby in the care of her mother and sister. But in 1964, she married a former merchant seaman and reclaimed Vernon, telling him for the first time that she was his real mother. According to his own account, Vernon Howell did not get on with his stepfather, who frequently thrashed him. He did poorly at school, where he was put into a special class and teased for being, quote, retarded. He also claimed that a group of older boys had raped him. He was said to have been dyslexic rather than mentally handicapped, but this does not seem to have prevented him from reading the Bible, since his mother stated that he knew the whole New Testament by heart at the age of 12. Later, this slow learner was to boast that he had more knowledge than all the great scholars could learn in a lifetime. This certainly is an unfortunate background, but others have suffered worse childhoods without becoming psychotic or monsters of cruelty. By the time he dropped out of school at the age of 14, Howell had attained success as an athlete and had overcome his earlier unpopularity. His reaction was to become arrogant and patronizing, attitudes which precluded his keeping many of the old jobs which he attempted. Howell was always hypersensitive to rejection, as was Jim Jones. At the age of 19, a 16-year-old girl whom he had got pregnant refused to live with him on the grounds that he was unfit to bring up a child. This shattered his confidence, and he began to suffer from mood swings of pathological intensity, sometimes believing himself to be uniquely evil, sometimes thinking that he was especially favoured by God. After various abortive attempts to find consolation in religion, Howell joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Tyler, Texas, and was baptized in 1979. He became infatuated with the pastor's daughter, claiming that God had spoken to him in a vision and said he would give the girl to him. Howell's behavior became so outrageous that in 1981 the pastor and his congregation expelled him. Howell's reaction to these rejections is interesting and follows the pattern of stress or illness succeeded by a new vision, which is characteristic of most gurus. His initial periods of depression were succeeded by an ever-mounting confidence that he had been specially selected by God, a conviction which may have been reinforced by the drug LSD, which he started to use in his late teens. Following his expulsion from the official Seventh-day Adventist Church, Howell joined a splinter group called the Branch Davidian Seventh-day Adventists. The story of how he became leader of this sect can be read in David Lepard's book, Fire and Blood, but need not detain us here. In 1988, Koresh managed to establish himself and his followers on a site originally called the New Mount Carmel Center, which occupied some 77 acres 10 miles east of Waco, Texas. Within 4 years, Howell, who had now changed his name to David Koresh, had established a regime closely resembling that instituted by Jim Jones in Guyana. With the aid of an associate, Mark Berrolt, whose home was in Hawaii, a number of rich businessmen were persuaded to finance the cult. The funds raised were used by Koresh for two main purposes: music equipment to further his ambition of becoming a rock star, and weapons to protect his cult against enemies. By the time the cult was being investigated by US authorities, Koresh had spent around $200,000 on weapons. His annual income amounted to $500,000. It was because a delivery man reported that pineapple hand grenades were being delivered to Koresh's commune that the train of events which culminated in its siege by the FBI and its ultimate destruction by fire was set in motion. Koresh resembled Jim Jones in being a fluent speaker. who could hold his listeners for hours at a time. Jones's vision was of a communist society in which private property was abolished and racial equality established. Koresh's vision was apocalyptic. As other apocalyptic prophets have done, Koresh laid hold upon the book of Revelation and claimed that he alone could interpret it correctly. He especially emphasized his unique insight into the 7 seals. According to David Lepard, Koresh said, quoting, "If you don't know the 7 seals, you really don't know Christ. The 7 seals are the acid test for who knows God and who doesn't." The book of Revelation was probably written about 95 to 96 AD. In it, Jesus is portrayed as a warrior who leads a host of angels to defeat the satanic forces ranged against him. Following the final defeat of evil, a kingdom is established in which selected human beings, rendered immortal, live forever in perfect peace and harmony. The opening of the book or scroll, which is sealed with 7 seals, heralds a series of terrible events which, as in other apocalyptic visions, are bound to precede the final establishment of peace and order. When the first seal is broken, a white horse appears, ridden by a rider armed with a bow and given a crown, who goes forth to conquer. The breaking of the second seal heralds a red horse and a rider who is given a great sword and the power to make men slaughter each other. Breaking the third seal releases a rider on a black horse who carries a pair of scales and who appears to be the herald of famine. When the fourth seal has been broken, a sickly, pale horse appears whose rider is death. He is given power over a quarter of the earth, with the right to kill by sword, famine, epidemics, or wild beasts. After the fifth seal has been broken, the souls of those who have been slaughtered for the faith complain, but they are reassured, provided with white robes, and told to wait until the tally of those destined to be killed for Christ's sake is complete. The breaking of the sixth seal is followed by a violent earthquake. The sun turns black, the moon red, and the stars fall out of the sky. Following the breaking of the seventh seal by the Lamb of God, silence reigns in heaven for half an hour. Then comes the destruction of a third of mankind, followed by the final defeat of the powers of darkness. Koresh seems to have convinced his followers that he himself had the power to break the seventh seal, thus precipitating the catastrophes described in the book of Revelation. He taught that God would return to earth with fire and lightning and establish a new kingdom in Israel with Koresh on the throne. He persuaded his followers that death was only a prelude to a better life to come, in which they would be among the army of elite immortals who were destined to slaughter all the wicked of the earth, beginning with the Christian church. Koresh's delusional system, like that of Jim Jones, took time to develop. At first, he alleged himself to be no more than a prophet, armed with special understanding of the seven seals. As his power increased, so did his claims for himself. When his defected disciple, Mark Briault, was asked whether Koresh believed himself to be the Son of God, Briault was emphatic that he did. When asked what control this gave Koresh over his followers, Briault replied, "Absolute control. I know it's hard for you to understand this, but just imagine you believe someone is Jesus Christ. He can tell you anything. If you argue, you go to hell. He's the Son of God. Who wants to fight against God?" By the time that his Texan prairie retreat was undergoing its terminal siege in April 1993, Koresh was claiming that he was God and signing his letters Yahweh Koresh. Ranch Apocalypse, as Koresh now renamed the Mount Carmel property, was a squalid enclosure. There was hardly any heating, and no running water or proper plumbing. Members of the cult who had to excrete into chamber pots and bury the contents into the ground had water supplied from a container brought in by truck. As in Jonestown, cult members soon developed a variety of ailments, including hepatitis B. Koresh considered that seeking medical help was a threat to his authority and forbade visits to doctors. He constantly imposed a string of varied dietary injunctions of an irrational kind. During 1 month, bananas were the only fruit allowed. It was forbidden to eat oranges and grapes at the same meal. On some days, only vegetables were allowed, and on others, food was restricted to fruit and popcorn. There was no hot food, and buying food from outside without Koresh's direct permission was forbidden. Koresh used starvation as a punishment, and many members of the cult suffered from malnutrition, as members of Jones's cult had done in Guyana. And, as in the case of Jones, Koresh himself was exempt from all dietary restrictions. His ridiculous rules and prohibitions were merely an added proof of his almost absolute power, on a par with the senseless and meaningless tasks which other gurus require of their followers. Another arbitrary exercise of power was Koresh's practice of waking the entire compound at night and compelling them to listen to his protracted expositions of the Bible, which sometimes went on for as long as 15 hours. The punishments instituted by Koresh were as savage as those employed by Jones. He taught that children as young as 8 months old should receive corporal punishment for misbehavior, and told their mothers that they would burn in hell if they refused to beat their children. Children were punished for the slightest misdemeanor by being beaten with a piece of wood, known as a helper. Each child had his own helper with his name on it. A special room was set aside for those beatings. Koresh beat his own 3-year-old son, Cyrus, so severely that it sickened Mark Briold, and no doubt contributed to Briold's eventual dissolution. Several of the 21 children who were eventually released bore the marks of recent beatings. Another punishment was to immerse the offender in sewage and not allow him or her to bathe. Derek Lovelock, an English survivor of the terminal siege, nevertheless insisted that Koresh was a very caring and compassionate man, and denied the accusations of cruelty and sexual abuse, although he did admit that parents sometimes beat their children. He told William Shaw that the months he spent at the ranch were the happiest days of his life. "We were one big family," he says. "We all believed in one belief and agreed on the same points. We were all one community." Koresh was as sexually rapacious as Jim Jones, but his tastes were different. In 1983, Koresh married Rachel, the daughter of an official of the Branch Davidian Church. She was only 14 years old, but no one objected. She bore him 3 children. In 1986, Koresh began sleeping with her younger sister, then 12 years old. When Koresh took command of the ranch apocalypse, he split up families by ensuring that the men slept on one floor and the women on another. Severing family ties was one way of reinforcing allegiance to himself, and also made it easier for him to seduce the women he wanted. Koresh considered himself entitled to have sexual relations with any of the females in the compound, including girls of 12 and 13. One child who was too small for penetration was urged to use large tampons in order that her vagina might become able to accommodate him. Koresh, like Jones, deteriorated mentally. He took a variety of vitamins and herbal remedies to cure what he called impotence, but drugs cannot be blamed for the development of his delusions as they can for Jones. He was less obviously a confidence trickster than Jones, but when Briault asked whether Koresh really believed what he was teaching or was just a con man, Briault replied, "I think a little of both. Vernon gets a craving, then he finds the theology to justify that craving. When others buy into his doctrine, he starts believing it himself." By 1986, he was teaching that he was entitled to 140 wives. When Ranch Apocalypse finally went up in flames, 17 of the 22 children who perished had been fathered by Koresh, who claimed that only he was allowed to procreate, and that part of his mission was to fill the world with righteous children. At the beginning of the FBI siege, Koresh allowed those children who were not fathered by him to be released. The psychiatrists who interviewed them repeatedly heard stories about dead babies. Some children alleged that the bodies of babies were stored in a freezer until they could be got rid of. It is possible, though unproven, that Koresh sacrificed the children of cult members because he himself was not their father. He certainly tried to persuade his followers that ritual sacrifices of children might be necessary. It is fair to add that reports about the condition of the children who were released varies. In his book, The Ashes of Waco, Dick J. Revis is chiefly concerned with attacking the clumsy way in which the ATF, the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, a branch of the US Treasury Department, and the FBI handled the siege, which he considered entirely unjustified. He claims that there is evidence that the children within the compound were well cared for, and quotes one psychiatrist who examined the released children as saying that there is no evidence of sexual abuse. When the FBI blasted holes in the compound buildings, they assumed that the mothers of small children would take the opportunity to escape with their offspring. No one did so. The final Holocaust was initiated by members of the cult, who used kerosene lamps to start the blaze. Not everyone who died was burnt alive. 27 cult members, including Koresh himself, were shot. Constructing or adopting a belief system in which one is either God's prophet or God himself inflates the ego to monstrous proportions. Koresh was more deeply concerned with religion, Jim Jones with racial equality and an egalitarian society. But both compensated for isolation and a lack of love in childhood by becoming infatuated with power, and both ended up with delusions of their own divinity. It seems almost incredible that either of these gurus could have retained the allegiance of their followers for so long. Koresh made some ineffective attempts to conceal the identity of the children whom he took to bed, but most of the outrageous sexual behavior and the appalling cruelty of each guru were paraded rather than concealed. There were very few defectors from either camp. It appears that once a guru has convinced a follower of his messianic status, his actual behavior, as judged by ordinary human standards, becomes largely irrelevant. Belief in a guru, while it persists, entirely overrules rational judgment. Dedicated disciples are as impervious to reason as are infatuated lovers. There is a well-known psychiatric phenomenon called the folie à deux. If two people live together and one is mad, the other may become convinced by at least some of the delusions expressed by the psychotic partner. If the psychotic partner is removed to hospital, the other partner usually recovers his or her sanity. Shared delusions are mutually reinforcing, and membership of a sect led by a psychotic leader reassures both the leader and the disciple who has fallen under his spell of the truth of their beliefs. Both Jim Jones and David Koresh kept their followers under close surveillance and made it difficult for anyone to leave. Fortunately, this is exceptional. Contrary to popular belief, most of those who join new religious movements are not subject to coercion, and many leave such movements without difficulty. But communities like Jonestown, which are isolated from normal sources of information, become more dependent on whatever information is given them by their leaders, and are less able to question what they are told. Research into so-called sensory deprivation has shown that individuals who are cut off from most varieties of sensory input by being placed in soundproof, lightproof rooms become more suggestible and tend to be less critical of any information which is fed to them. The same is true of isolated communities. In addition, anyone within the community who dares to doubt the pronouncements of the guru is likely to be treated as a traitor by his fellows. Jones and Koresh, to all except their disciples, appear to have been evil madmen. They exhibited, in exaggerated form, with very few redeeming features, all the worst possible characteristics of gurus. Fortunately, the majority of gurus are not as bad as they were. We need to examine some other varieties.